I was about to marry Adrian, the man I thought I would spend forever with. But as I stood at the altar in my white dress, waiting for the words that would bind us, I watched him sprint down the aisle, abandoning me without a second glance. He didn't run toward me. He ran back to her. Isla, his first love, the woman who had been in a coma for years, had woken up on my wedding day, alone, heartbroken, shattered. I stood there, my dreams crashing around me, and the echo of Adrian's flight still ringing in my ears. He left me in front of everyone, humiliated, and I had no choice but to disappear, broken, but determined to rebuild my life, piece by agonizing piece. But as I started to heal, the past came crashing back in. Adrian returned, desperate, broken, on his knees, begging for another chance. And just like that, I was forced to face a choice that could ruin me again. This is the story of how I found the courage to let go of the past, how I learned to trust in a love that was real, and how I realized that sometimes, being left at the altar is the very thing that sets you free. Story begins. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel. Like, share, and subscribe to join our channel's journey. Chapter 1. The day the past woke up. On the day I was supposed to marry Adrian, the world seemed perfect. The cathedral was a dream, straight out of a fairy tale. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the marble floors in hues of ruby, gold, and sapphire. Candles flickered along the pews, and the soft scent of roses, white of course, mingled with the faint musk of old wood and incense. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as guests shuffled in their seats, but it was drowned by the gentle swell of the organ playing Ave Maria. My gown shimmered as I moved, its delicate lace catching the light. My mother had cried when she saw me in it. "You look like an angel, Eva," and for once, I believed her. Even the anxious butterflies flitting in my stomach felt like the good kind. The kind that told you everything was exactly as it should be. Adrian stood at the altar in a perfectly tailored black suit, his hands steady as he waited for me. His smile, nervous, endearing, had carried me down the aisle. This man, who had once been broken, had become my rock. The one who held me when I cried over bad days, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who made me feel seen. After 6 years, we were finally here together. The pastor's voice brought me back to the present. "Do you, Adrian, take Eva to be your lawfully wedded wife?" I watched Adrian as the words hung in the air, as though time itself had slowed. That's when I noticed it, the shift, subtle at first, the way his brow furrowed just slightly, like he'd remembered something he'd forgotten to do. Then his shoulders stiffened, his whole body going rigid as his eyes darted downward. His phone vibrated. I didn't hear it, but I felt it, a faint hum against the hush of the church, like a fly trapped in a still room. It wasn't loud enough to be noticed by anyone else, but to me, it was deafening. Adrian's hand moved instinctively, slipping into his pocket. My pulse quickened as I saw him check the screen, the light from the phone reflecting on his pale face. His lips parted slightly. Whatever he read had drained the life out of him. I frowned. "Adrian? Is something wrong?" I whispered, barely audible. He didn't answer. His breaths came faster now, shallow and uneven, like he was trying to keep from falling apart. The phone trembled in his grip. I watched as his thumb hovered over the screen, unable to move, unable to do anything. "Adrian," I repeated, louder this time. The concern in my voice broke through the pastor's words. A murmur rippled through the guests. He looked up at me then, but it wasn't the gaze of the man who had loved me for 6 years. There was no joy, no excitement, only panic and guilt. The ring in his other hand slipped through his fingers, landing with a hollow clink on the floor. I flinched. "Adrian?" My voice cracked. His chest heaved, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, Adrian looked utterly lost. A man torn between two worlds, one he had chosen, and another he could not escape. He glanced toward the doors at the back of the church, his eyes wild, desperate, as if waiting for someone to burst through. "Adrian, what's happening?" I asked, my hands trembling now as the perfect illusion of the day splintered. His lips moved, but no words came out, and then he turned. It happened so fast. One moment, he was standing there, his phone still clutched like a lifeline. The next, he spun on his heel, and sprinted down the aisle, shoving the heavy cathedral doors open with a force that rattled the walls. The guests gasped. "Adrian!" I shouted, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. My father rose from his seat, his face red with confusion and anger. But I stopped him with a weak shake of my head. "Let him go," I whispered, though I could barely hear myself over the roar in my ears. I stood frozen, my hands empty, my chest hollow. I already knew where he was going. Isla had woken up. The room tilted slightly as I took a shaky breath. guests murmured, shifting in their seats. I could feel their eyes on me, pity, confusion, curiosity. But I couldn't bear to meet their gazes. I stared at the empty space where Adrian had been. My gown suddenly felt too heavy, as though the weight of it might pull me straight to the floor. Beside me, the pastor still held his Bible, his mouth open in shock, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "Eva," my mother whispered softly from the front row. "Sweetheart?" I turned toward her voice, my vision blurring as tears welled in my eyes. My father was already moving, his expression dark with anger. He was ready to chase Adrian down, ready to fix what couldn't be fixed. But what was the point? I swallowed back the knot in my throat and straightened my shoulders. I wouldn't fall apart. Not here. Not now. Instead, I bent down, picked up the silver band Adrian had dropped, and held it in my palm. The metal felt cold, unfamiliar. I studied it for a moment, this small, meaningless circle that had once symbolized forever. Then I set it gently on the altar. "Thank you all for coming," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough to carry through the stunned silence. "The wedding is over." I turned and walked down the aisle, my heels clicking against the marble floor like punctuation marks to an unfinished story. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The days after the wedding that wasn't felt like waking up underwater. Everything was slow, distorted, and muffled, as though the world existed at the edge of my senses. I moved through the hours with a quiet numbness that scared the people around me more than tears ever could. I didn't cry. Not right away. On the day I left the apartment Adrian and I had shared, I packed in silence, my hands working methodically as if the act of sorting my life into boxes could somehow restore order. I placed the wedding dress, now tainted with memories of shame, into a garment bag and pushed it deep into the closet. I wouldn't sell it or burn it. That felt too dramatic, too theatrical for the quiet grief gnawing at my chest. Instead, it would sit there, buried like a ghost. Rebecca, my best friend and former college roommate, stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching me with a mix of worry and disbelief. She was the only one brave enough to say what everyone else was thinking. "I can't believe he just ran," she said softly, her arms crossed as if trying to protect herself from the sheer ridiculousness of it all. "I mean, what kind of man does that? At his own wedding?" The corner of my mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Almost. One with unfinished business," I murmured, folding a sweater and placing it in my suitcase. Rebecca scoffed. "That's not unfinished business, Eva. That's insanity." "Did he even explain anything?" I shook my head. "No. He didn't have to. Because I knew." Isla? Her name echoed in my mind, a whisper that never quite faded. I could see her face because I'd seen it every day for almost a year. I'd met Isla long before I met Adrian. Fresh out of nursing school, I'd been assigned to the ICU at St. Mary's Hospital, my hands still shaking every time I adjusted an IV or monitored vitals. Isla had been my patient, a woman frozen in time by a tragic car accident that shattered her body and left her in a coma. She was beautiful in the way statues were beautiful, perfect, untouchable, and unmoving. I'd wash her hair, braid it sometimes, and talk to her as though she could hear me. "Your fiancé visits you every day," I'd tell her softly while adjusting the machines. "He must really love you." I hadn't seen his face until a month later. He arrived late one evening, when the ward was quiet except for the hum of ventilators and the soft beep of heart monitors. I was checking Isla's chart when I felt him behind me. "Adrian." "Isla." His voice cracked as he stepped toward the bed, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked like a man unraveling, held together only by grief. "She's stable today," I said quietly, watching him from the corner of my eye. He looked up then, and for the briefest moment, his gaze locked on mine. It startled me how young he was, no older than 30, and yet the weight he carried made him look older. We didn't say much that first day, but after that, he came every evening. Sometimes he brought flowers, though Isla couldn't see them. Other times he just sat by her side, holding her hand as though his touch alone could wake her. I admired him. It was hard not to. His loyalty was unshakable. Even as the months passed, and the doctors began to lower their voices when speaking about Isla's prognosis. "She's not coming back," they'd say when Adrian wasn't around. Not really. But Adrian believed she would. I didn't expect him to notice me. At first, I was just a nurse who helped keep the machines running, who smiled politely when he thanked me for taking care of her. But after a while, the polite smiles turned into small conversations. He started asking about me, how long I'd been at the hospital, why I'd chosen nursing. I learned that Adrian was a writer, though he hadn't written anything since Isla's accident. I learned that he loved coffee but hated tea, that he played the piano, that he had a laugh, warm and deep. That didn't seem to fit the broken man I'd met. And then Isla's condition worsened. Adrian had been out of town visiting family when it happened. By the time he returned, Isla's body was fighting itself, organs failing one by one. I was the one who called him to say she might not make it through the night. When he arrived, I had to stop him in the hall, my hands on his chest as he tried to push past me. "You can't go in there yet," I told him, my voice shaking as tears streamed down his face. "Please," he choked out. "Please, I have to see her." It was the first time he touched me, his hands curling around my wrists as though I were the only thing keeping him from falling apart. I don't know how long we stood there in that dim hallway, but when he finally sank to the floor, I sat with him. He told me that he had promised Isla he would always be there for her, that he would never let her be alone. But Isla survived that night, and the next, and the next. 2 months later, Adrian asked me to dinner. I didn't want to say yes, not at first. I told myself it was too soon, that I was a placeholder for someone he couldn't let go of. But he looked at me like I was real, like I wasn't just the nurse who braided Isla's hair. And I fell for it. I fell for him. "Do you hate her?" Rebecca asked suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. We were sitting on her couch now, a bottle of wine between us. It was late, and the city outside her apartment pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the quiet ache in my chest. "Isla?" I clarified, swirling the wine in my glass. Rebecca nodded. I thought about it for a moment. Did I hate her? The woman who had unknowingly held Adrian's heart hostage for years? The woman I'd spent hours caring for, only to become her shadow? "No," I said finally, my voice soft. "I don't hate her." Rebecca frowned. "How? After everything?" "Because it's not her fault." And it wasn't. Isla had no control over what happened to her. She didn't ask to be trapped in time, to become the untouchable woman Adrian couldn't let go of. I didn't hate her, but I resented the pedestal she stood on. So high, so untarnished, that I could never reach it. How do you compete with a love story that never got the chance to fall apart? A memory frozen in perfection? You can't. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something else. I wasn't just angry at Adrian for leaving me. I was angry at myself, for ignoring the warning signs, for thinking I could replace someone he'd never truly let go of, for believing, however foolishly, that I would be enough. But love built on shadows will always crumble in the light. And now the light was here, bright and blinding. Chapter 3. A New Beginning. When I left the city, I didn't just leave Adrian behind. I left behind the version of myself who believed love could conquer anything. That woman had been hopeful, trusting, and eager to see the good in people. But she was gone now, scattered like ashes in the wind. I wasn't sure who I was anymore, but I knew I couldn't figure it out in a place where his ghost haunted every corner. Rebecca was the one who saved me, in a way only a best friend could. She lived in a small town 2 hours from the city, in a charming old house she inherited from her grandmother. It had creaky floorboards, mismatched furniture, and a kitchen that always smelled of fresh bread and lavender. It felt like a sanctuary. "You can stay here as long as you need," Rebecca said when I arrived. Her words were casual, but the way she hugged me told me she'd been waiting to say them for weeks. No deadlines, no expectations, just be. I didn't have a plan, but at that moment, I didn't need one. I needed to breathe. The first month passed in a haze. I slept in Rebecca's guest room with the floral wallpaper, and the windows that overlooked a little garden she swore would come back to life in spring. I spent most mornings on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket, drinking coffee and staring at nothing in particular. It was autumn, and the world outside matched my mood, trees shedding their leaves, skies gray and brooding, a quiet melancholy lingering in the air. Rebecca gave me space but kept me tethered to reality in her subtle, determined way. She left mugs of chamomile tea on my nightstand when I couldn't sleep. She forced me to eat when my appetite disappeared, pushing bowls of homemade soup across the table with a no-nonsense glare. And when I sat on the couch for hours, staring into the void, she'd plop herself down beside me, flick on a terrible rom-com, and say, "We're going to watch people embarrass themselves until you laugh, or I'll throw popcorn at you." She kept me alive in those days, more alive than I would have been on my own. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, when I ventured into town for the first time, that I met Ryan again. He was a familiar face I hadn't seen in years, someone I'd known back in university, though we'd traveled in different circles. Ryan had been one of those guys who seemed perpetually calm, the kind who always had a book under his arm, and a kind word for anyone who crossed his path. I spotted him in a small bookstore near the town square, where I'd gone to escape Rebecca's persistent attempts to get me into yoga. I was wandering the aisles aimlessly when a deep, familiar voice broke through my thoughts. Eva? I turned, startled. And there he was, Ryan Mason. He looked exactly the same, though maybe a little older, with faint lines around his eyes and a touch of gray at his temples. He was holding a coffee in one hand and a stack of books in the other, his expression a mix of surprise and genuine warmth. Ryan, I said, blinking as though I'd conjured him out of thin air. What are you doing here? He smiled sheepishly, holding up his books. Working through my reading list. I'm teaching now, literature at the high school. Of course he was. Ryan always did love books more than most people. And you? He asked gently, searching my face as if piecing together the clues of why I was there. I heard you were in the city. I was. I didn't offer more. Ryan was too kind to pry, but I could see the understanding in his gaze. Small towns had a way of keeping tabs on people. Word had probably traveled about the runaway groom, though Rebecca had shielded me from most of it. He nodded as if to say, "It's okay, I won't ask." Instead, he gestured toward the shop's little coffee counter. "Let me buy you a cup. It's been years." That coffee turned into an afternoon spent talking about everything except the things that mattered most. Ryan told me about his work, how he loved teaching, but hated grading papers. I told him about my brief career in nursing, leaving out the pieces tied to Adrian and Isla. It was easy, being around him. Ryan had this quiet presence about him, the kind that didn't demand anything. Over the weeks that followed, I kept running into him, at the bakery, where he'd be buying croissants for his class, at the park, where he sat on a bench with a notebook, scribbling away, at the farmer's market on Saturdays, where he always seemed to end up, in line right behind me. It was almost comical how often we crossed paths, until one day he grinned at me and said, "You know, if you keep running into me like this, people are going to talk." I rolled my eyes. "You live in a town with 2 stoplights, Ryan. People already talk." Slowly, without realizing it, I began to stitch myself back together. It wasn't dramatic or fast, there were no epiphanies, or montages of me dancing in the rain. Healing came in small moments, Rebecca dragging me to trivia night at the pub, Ryan showing up at my doorstep with a book he thought I'd like, quiet mornings in the garden, where I dug my hands into the earth and planted seeds I wasn't sure would grow. It was Ryan's presence, though, that steadied me most. He never pushed or asked for more than I was willing to give. He'd show up with 2 coffees, one just the way I liked it, no cream, no sugar, and sit beside me, talking about everything and nothing. On the days when I felt like breaking, he didn't offer words or platitudes. He just stayed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in streaks of gold and violet, I turned to him and said, "You're too nice, Ryan. You don't even know what you're getting into." He looked at me for a long moment before replying softly, "I'm not here to fix you, Eva. I'm just here." And for the first time in months, I let myself believe that might be enough. It wasn't love, not yet. What Ryan gave me in those months was far more important. The space to breathe, to exist, and to figure out who I was without Adrian's shadow looming over me. I started to see glimpses of myself again. I remembered the things I used to love, painting, long walks, sitting in cafes with a good book and no one to impress. I learned that healing didn't mean erasing the pain, but learning to carry it differently, in a way that no longer weighed me down. When spring finally arrived and the garden bloomed, Rebecca found me outside one afternoon, hands dirty, surrounded by wildflowers. She leaned against the porch railing, smiling faintly. "There you are," she said. "Where?" I asked, brushing dirt from my jeans. She tilted her head. "Back in the world." And maybe I was. Chapter 4. A perfect day. The morning of my wedding to Ryan arrived quietly, as if the universe itself wanted to honor this day. There was no chaos, no rushing, just sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains, and the soft sounds of birdsong outside my window. I sat on the edge of Rebecca's guest bed, which had become my own in the last 2 years, and took a deep breath. "Today's the day," I whispered to myself. From the doorway, Rebecca's voice interrupted my reverie. "You look terrifyingly calm for a woman about to get married." I glanced up to find her leaning against the frame, holding 2 mugs of coffee. Her smile was warm, but her eyes held something more, a quiet pride. She'd been there when I was at my lowest, and now here I was, putting my heart back together in front of her eyes. "I think I've already been through the worst of what a wedding day can bring," I said with a small laugh. Rebecca snorted, and handed me a coffee. "Fair point. But you know, this is different. Ryan isn't Adrian." No, he wasn't. Ryan was steady, patient, and kind, the calm I hadn't known I needed. He was a man who didn't run when things got hard, a man who loved me not for the pieces he hoped to fix but for the woman I had become. The ceremony was set on a secluded beach, where the sand was soft and white, and the waves whispered against the shore like secrets shared between old friends. Ryan had chosen this place, because I once told him I'd always dreamed of marrying near the ocean. It was thoughtful like everything he did. Rebecca fussed over the lace hem of my dress as the final touches were put in place. The gown was simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery that danced when the wind kissed the fabric. It felt light, nothing like the heavy satin of the dress I'd worn on the day Adrian left. That dress had weighed me down like chains. This one made me feel free. "Are you ready?" Rebecca asked, her voice softer now. I turned to the mirror. My reflection stared back, a woman with clear eyes, a steady smile, and a heart that no longer belonged to the past. "Yes," I said, more to myself than to her. "I'm ready." Ryan stood beneath a wooden arch wrapped in white roses and greenery, looking as though he belonged nowhere else but there. His suit was simple, tailored to perfection, and his sandy brown hair ruffled slightly in the breeze. When he saw me walking toward him, his smile widened, lighting up his entire face. I thought my heart might burst. This time, I wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. There were no shadows, no unanswered questions hanging over us. Only the sound of the ocean, and the man who waited for me. The guests rose to their feet, and I saw familiar faces: Rebecca, her fiancé Greg, Ryan's family, and the friends I'd made over the last 2 years. They were people who had become my family, people who had stood by me as I learned to stand on my own again. With every step I took toward Ryan, the weight of the past grew lighter. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began once I reached him, his voice calm and steady, "we are gathered here today to join Eva and Ryan in marriage." I hardly heard the words. I was too lost in the way Ryan was looking at me, like I was the most precious thing he'd ever seen. His gaze was steady, unwavering, as if he were promising me 1,000 lifetimes with just his eyes. "Do you, Eva, take Ryan to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," I whispered, my voice steady. "Do you, Ryan, take Eva to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Before Ryan could answer, the peace of the moment was shattered. The sound of screeching tires on gravel cut through the ceremony like a knife. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as a black car skidded to a halt just beyond the edge of the beach. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that stretches too long, too tense, before a man stepped out of the car. "Adrian." A gasp rippled through the guests as he stumbled forward. He looked nothing like the man I once loved. His suit was wrinkled and stained with dust, his face pale and hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days. His dark hair was disheveled, and his eyes, once so full of confidence, were red-rimmed and desperate. "Eva!" he shouted, his voice raw and cracking. "Please don't do this. Don't marry him." The entire world seemed to stand still, but Ryan moved immediately. He stepped in front of me, his broad frame shielding me like a fortress. "You need to leave," Ryan said firmly, his voice calm but commanding. Adrian ignored him. His bloodshot eyes found mine, and for a moment, I saw the man who had once held my heart. But now there was nothing left of that connection, no love, no longing, only emptiness. "Eva," he whispered, dropping to his knees in the sand. His shoulders trembled violently as he clasped his hands together like a man in prayer. "I ended things with Isla. I was wrong, I was so wrong. I can't live without you. I love you. Please come back to me." I stared at him, unblinking, while the murmurs of the guests surrounded us. Once, I might have crumbled at this sight, at the raw, broken man who begged for forgiveness. But that was the woman I used to be. I wasn't her anymore. Ryan turned to me, his eyes searching mine, silently asking if I wanted him to handle this. I shook my head and stepped forward. Adrian looked up, hope flickering in his gaze as I approached. "Adrian," I said softly, my voice carrying over the waves. "You don't get to ruin my life twice." His face crumpled as though I had struck him. "But you chose her," I continued, my words steady. "You chose Isla, and I spent years picking up the pieces of what you left behind. You don't get to come back now, just because you've realized what you lost." Tears streaked his face as he tried to respond, but I didn't let him. "Go home, Adrian. Let me go." Ryan was beside me in an instant, his hand closing around mine, strong and steady, a silent promise that he was there. He turned to one of the groomsmen and nodded. "Call the police," Ryan said. Adrian let out a strangled cry as the officers arrived, their quiet professionalism a stark contrast to his disheveled panic. They led him away, his voice breaking into hoarse, pleading sobs. But I didn't look back. Ryan's hand squeezed mine gently as the chaos faded, the beach falling quiet once more. He turned to me, concern flickering in his eyes. Are you okay? I looked up at him, the man who had been my rock, my constant, and my future, and smiled. I'm more than okay. The pastor cleared his throat softly, his expression apologetic. Shall we continue? Ryan's gaze never left mine. Only if you're ready, he murmured. I nodded. I'm ready. When Ryan slid the ring onto my finger, the world felt right again. His words were a promise, not just of love but of a life shared in partnership and trust. And when the pastor finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Ryan pulled me close, and kissed me softly, as though sealing every vow we'd made with that single, perfect moment. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, I rested my head on Ryan's shoulder. The waves crashed gently, and the world seemed to whisper, "You're home now." "I'll love you forever, Eva," Ryan whispered. I smiled, closing my eyes against the golden light. Forever sounds perfect. Chapter 5. Forever sounds perfect. The weeks following the wedding were a blur of quiet happiness, gentle moments, and a peace I had long forgotten I could feel. Ryan and I chose to spend our honeymoon in a small coastal village, a place where time seemed to slow to a crawl, and the only sounds were the whisper of waves, and the call of gulls. Every morning, we would wake to the smell of salt in the air, and the golden glow of sunlight peeking through the sheer curtains of our little cottage. We spent our days walking along rocky shorelines, collecting shells like children, and laughing over nothing at all. It felt like I'd stepped into a version of my life that I had once dreamed about. One where love wasn't something fragile or fleeting, but something steady and certain. I remember sitting on the porch one evening, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ryan sat beside me, his arm draped loosely across the back of my chair. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly. I glanced at him, at the man who had saved me not by swooping in like a hero, but by simply being there, patient and consistent, until I realized I didn't need saving at all. I was just thinking. I trailed off, choosing my words carefully. It's funny how life works out, isn't it? How you can think one chapter is your entire story, only to realize it was just the prologue. Ryan tilted his head, a soft smile playing on his lips. "You're not looking back, are you?" "No," I said immediately. "Not anymore." Because I wasn't. For the first time in years, the past didn't feel like a shadow I needed to escape. It was just the past. A place I had survived. A place I had left behind. When we returned from the honeymoon, reality felt kinder than it had before. Ryan and I moved into a little house on the edge of town. A cottage with ivy crawling up the walls, and a front porch where I could drink my coffee in the mornings. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was ours. I planted roses in the garden, and Ryan built me a wooden bench under the oak tree that shaded the yard. Sometimes on weekends, Rebecca and her husband would visit. She'd sit on the bench with me, drinking iced tea, while the sun warmed our faces, and we'd talk about everything and nothing all at once. One day, Rebecca turned to me suddenly. "Do you ever think about him?" I didn't need to ask who she meant. I shook my head. "Not in the way I used to." She gave me a knowing look. "You're stronger than you realize, Eva." Maybe she was right. I didn't feel like the same woman who had been left at the altar. The same woman who had once stood frozen as her world shattered. That version of me had been broken, fragile, and afraid. But piece by piece, I had stitched myself back together. I had built a new life. Not out of desperation, but out of choice. One evening, a letter arrived, no return address, just my name written in shaky, familiar handwriting. Adrian. Ryan found me staring at the envelope, holding it like it might burst into flames. "You don't have to read it, you know," he said quietly. But I wanted to. I needed to. I opened the letter and read the few sentences Adrian had scrawled in uneven lines. "Eva. I'm sorry for everything I put you through. I thought Isla waking up would give me a second chance, but I've realized now that some things can't be undone. I hope you're happy, I truly do. You deserve that, Adrian." The letter didn't hurt me the way I thought it would. It didn't make me angry or sad. It just was. I folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer, where it would gather dust along with the other remnants of a life I no longer lived. When I returned to the living room, Ryan was waiting for me, concern flickering in his eyes. "Are you okay?" I smiled at him, at the man who had been my second chance, not because he saved me, but because he let me save myself. "I'm better than okay," I said, sitting beside him and lacing my fingers through his. That was the truth. I was finally free of the past. Story ends. Thanks for listening. See you again for another silly story.